So the way that this is a huge part of the Gospels, and the way that Jesus mythicists, theorists deal with this is by just not going there. It's just not dealt with. This person existed, and he really taught these revolutionary things. R.T. France concludes that of the Gospel of Mark, which has less teaching than some of the other Gospels, the Gospel of Mark is about 40 to 50% teaching. So you can't just ignore that. Say, we're talking about the Christ, not the teacher Christ, but the others. This is the Christ of the Gospels. You can't pull him out of his historical roots. The Jesus of Scripture is a historical person. If you want to debate whether you believe this miracle or that or the resurrection, it's a different debate. But anything more than that becomes a kind of lie or deception. Also, the earliest evidence comes from primary sources, such as the sources lying behind Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are primary sources, but there are sources that go back before them. Here's how we fill in the gap. You see in your notes, we fill in the gap between Jesus, the Jesus event, the historical person who originates the teachings, and when they're later written down in the Gospels, which is just decades later, which is very close within ancient historical context. Jesus was an itinerant teacher. He walked about planting his teaching in different communities. He would repeat much of the same stories and teach different things within different contexts. And as he travels around teaching, communities sprout up and they begin to steward the teaching through oral tradition. They may have written it down, we don't know, but certainly through oral tradition, they now begin to steward the teaching. And their teaching is similar and different from all the other communities, all having different stories of what Jesus did and the things that he taught. And it's only a matter of decades until the gospel writers then write their gospels, and they borrow, they listen to, and they hear. They know their own experience. They have original stuff in their gospels that relates to their own experience, but they also listen, copy down what Jesus taught and did in other communities. Then they present back to the communities. These were gifts to the churches and stewarded by the churches. They give back to the church communities written versions of their own oral tradition. And the oral tradition of that community would then become an inherent filter against mythology creeping into the written Gospels. Here, oral tradition is a strength, not a weakness, in that once the Gospel writers present the Gospels back to these churches that are now going to preserve the written documents, they better reflect what those communities have already been stewarding as the teaching and life and deeds of Jesus of Nazareth. Or they're going to say, hey, wait a second, we're risking our lives being part of this group, and you're feeding us stuff that didn't happen. We're here and we're alive and we're committed even to die for a cause based on the teachings that we've been stewarding since the time Christ came. And so the oral tradition over the decades gap keeps the message pure and holds the gospel accounts accountable. Before that, you have the Apostle Paul writing in the 50s. All of his letters are done by 60. He's writing in the 50s, amazingly early to the 30s when Jesus was doing his ministry. And by that point, Paul is already saying, I'm learning the traditions of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, and you see the teachings of Jesus reflected in Paul's writings. You're going to talk about that in more detail and look up some examples of that in home church. So the gap almost doesn't exist in a historical context between the actual Christ event and the writing of the Gospels. But someone will say, but the Bible doesn't count as evidence. Why? Well, it's one voice. It's not one voice. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of the documents. These are different documents. You have different oral traditions, then you have different gospels written. Gospels are given to different churches, and then they are copied and preserved within different churches and then traded about. Yes, it's hundreds of years later that it all gets brought together, these existing manuscripts, and put under one roof, so to speak, for convenience, and in a book. And then it's the printing press that puts it all together in one book. But they all grow from different, independent Jesus traditions and primary sources. But because they're first century documents, that was one of the main criterion for the Gospels. Are they first century? Can they be close enough to the events to be trusted? Unlike the Gnostic Gospels, which are second century and beyond. Are they first century Gospels? Are they close enough to be historically accurate? If so, we'll include them. So it sounds like it's one voice, but there's multiple independent attestation that goes right back to the Christ event itself. So when people say, oh, you can't trust the Bible, why? It was embraced by the church because of its first century authenticity. And others will say, yeah, but the gospel writers were biased. Yes, and every historian who has written has been biased. Bias is never a reason for not trusting history. It's a reason for reading history with your eyes open. And if any historical writer claims not to be biased, that's the one you have to watch out for. But the gospel writers, in fact, if the gospel writers really had seen the things they saw and had heard the teaching that they heard, and still said, well, I'm an objective, non-believer, dispassionate observer, then you would be suspicious of them. Because to actually have experienced that and to write about it and not get involved in a committed, faithful way would be suspicious. We can't fault them that they actually came to believe in the Jesus that they hung out with. We would never accept that for any other form of writing today. Because you're too closely involved, you can't be trusted. We would never say that a feminist cannot write on women's studies because she is too emotionally involved in the subject. We would never say that a homosexual cannot be trusted as an author on gay rights issues because they're just too emotionally involved with the subject. We would never say that a Jew cannot be trusted to do good history on the Holocaust because it's just too personal for them. They're biased. This is unacceptable. And every writing and every historical writing breaks down if we say we can't listen to you because you're biased. Yes, they're biased because they had an encounter with a historical person who rocked their world, changed it upside down. We should not be afraid of the bias. It's part of the history as we see their own journey reflected in the texts themselves. Let's look at Zeitgeist clip number 4. Zeitgeist clip number 4. Let's watch that one.
The reality is, Jesus was the solar deity
Zeitgeist
of
clip number 4. Clip number 4. I think that's 6.
How many of these historians document this figure? Not one. However, to be fair, that doesn't mean defenders of the historical Jesus haven't claimed the contrary. 4 historians are typically referenced to justify Jesus' existence. Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, and Tacitus are the first 3. Each one of their entries consists of only a few sentences at best, and only referred to Christus or the Christ, which in fact is not a name but a title. It means the Anointed One.
Now here's a great technique. When you're on a roll of proving something, you can just say more statements that actually don't prove anything. They're just statements, and it feels emotionally like you've just proved something. Did you hear what he said? Here are 3 ancient historians, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, and Tacitus, that Christians often turn to. Well, historians often turn to. You say, he says Christians, makes it sound biased, but actually just general historians, believers or not, turn to say they at least mention Christ. And he says, well, what does he say that apparently feels like it disproves that? He says they only mention a few lines of who? Of Christ. He's agreeing they mention a few lines. These are not books about Jesus. We wouldn't expect them to have more than a few lines. They do mention a few lines. He says, yeah, but they don't call him Jesus. They refer to him as the Messiah or Christ. It is a title. Exactly. And these are 3 ancient historians who refer to the Christ or the Messiah as a historical person, read them all, as a historical person who began the Jesus movement, who began the Messiah movement. And they refer to him as the Messiah, as the man who started the Messiah movement. Exactly. And he's just stated that as though it's shocking. And no one slows down enough to say, wow, that's a fascinating microphone. He then goes on to talk about Josephus, which I find also fascinating, but that's going to have to wait for the drive home. Let's throw it open to Q&A. I'm going to take a moment for Q&A. I've already gone over time, but we'll just take a couple of moments for some Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. Hello.
Hi.
And anyone else who has a question, raise your hand, and we'll try and get a mic into your hand, and we'll do 2 questions.
Hi. Does he ever mention anything